Beneath a sky veined with blood-red clouds and a moon that flickered like a dying ember, the old mansion sat in a forgotten clearing deep within the woods. The house itself seemed to sag under the weight of centuries of rot, its beams twisted and sagging like the body of those who had long lived there. It was home to the old Necromancer family, the Mortis clan, whose bones rattled in the wind like whispers long forgotten. Tonight was a night of great importance, for it was the birth of a long-awaited heir, an undead child destined to carry on the lineage. Crows circled overhead, their beady eyes glinting with hunger as they watched the parade of decay shuffle toward the mansion. Ragged silhouettes stumbled through the dying trees, each dragging limbs at unnatural angles, flesh slogging off from their bodies in greasy strips. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and freshly turned soil. Inside, the house pulsed with an eerie glow, casting long shadows that danced across the decaying walls. Family members, distant and close, had gathered from the farthest graves and crypts to witness the event. The great hall was adorned in a macabre display. Blood-stained banners hung from the rafters, sewn together from the skins of the recently unearthed. The centerpiece was a grotesque cake, not made of sugar and flour, but molded from layers of sinew and bone, the icing a putrid green dripping with foul ooze. The guests shuffled around their room, their hollowed eyes glistening with strange excitement. In one corner, Grandmother Zathra, her mouth permanently twisted in a grimace, was instructing younger undead in a Name That Lin game. Several body parts, each unique in its decay, were passed around for guest to guess its original owner. Giggles, the sound of gurgled death rattles, filled the air as hands swapped rotting digits and twisted feet. Further into the room, another game was taking place, a twisted version of Pin the Tail on the Donkey, except the donkey was a stitched-together corpse pinned to the wall, its chest cavity wide open. Blindfolded guests took turns inserting rusty nails into its still beating heart, each winner rewarded with a sliver of flesh. Laughter echoed through the halls, a mixture of delighted screeches and wet groans of decomposing throats. The air grew thick with anticipation when Matron Thalia, the expectant mother, finally entered the hall. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her gown trailing behind her, torn and bloodied from past labors. Her belly bulged grotesquely, the child within squirming, pressing against the taut gray skin. Every eye in the room turned to her, hollowed sockets filled with dark hunger and reverence. Thalia made her way to the altar at the center of the room, where a stone slab lay cold and waiting, stained with the blood of past births. The eerie chanting of an ancient dirge began to rise, led by the family's patriarch, a withered husk of a figure whose eyes had long rotted away, yet who saw all. The guests gathered around, their breath rattling in their chests, a collective anticipation rising with each gurgled breath. "Let the birthing begin," Patriarch croaked, his voice like the scraping of dry bones. Thalia lay upon the slab, her chest rising and falling in a slow, unnatural rhythm. Her skin split further as her belly convulsed, and without a cry, without a wince, her hands tore into her own abdomen. The sound of flesh ripping and bones snapping echoed through the hall, a grotesque symphony that sent shivers of dark joy through the gathered crowd. Blood, black as pitch, poured from the gaping wound, and her fingers found purchase around the squirming form within. With a final yank, she pulled the child from her womb. The room filled with the sickening squelch of wet meat hitting stone. The baby, if it could even be called that, writhed in its mother's hands, Its eyes were the color of death, cloudy, milky orbs that blinked for the first time in a world of decay. The infant's skin was a patchwork of rot and exposed bone, its tiny mouth gnashing at the air, ravenous from the moment of birth. The crowd surged forward, hissing with approval, as Thalia held the newborn high above her head, blood still dripping from its writhing body. "The heir of the Mortis clan!" she cried, her voice dripping with dark triumph. The baby screeched, the sound like nails dragged across a coffin lid. As was tradition, the family began their sacred offering. One by one, they stepped forward, each offering a piece of themselves to feed the newborn. To solidify the bond of blood and bone, Uncle Draylen, whose eyes were milky pools of pus, reached into his chest with a clawed hand and yanked free a rib, snapping it with a sickening crunch before placing it in the infant's mouth. The baby gnawed at it, its tiny teeth scraping across the bone. Aunt Fenora followed, her jaw half detached as she ripped free a chunk of her own arm, the exposed bone gleaming white against the darkened flesh. She held it to the child, who eagerly devoured it, its hunger insatiable. Cousins, distant relatives, and old friends each followed, each pulling from their decaying forms an ear, a finger, a patch of scalp, until the baby was gorged on the flesh of its own kin. The room buzzed with twisted pride. This child, this grotesque spawn of rot and decay, was the future of the Mortis clan. The ceremony had been a success, families' bond renewed in the only way they knew how, through the shared sacrifice of their own decaying bodies. Thalia, weak but triumphant, cradled the baby in her arms as she slumped back onto the stone altar. Her hollow eyes looked around the room, meeting the gaze of her undead kin, and with a sickening grin that spread across her torn face, she whispered, "Family is forever." The room fell silent for a moment, the only sound the soft wet chewing of the newborn as it gnawed on the remnants of its family's offerings. Then with a collective moan, the clan burst into a final round of guttural laughter, their undead hearts filled with twisted joy. The night was far from over, and as the shadows grew longer and the moon flickered overhead, the Mortis clan gathered closer, their bonds cemented by blood, decay, and the birth of their long-awaited heir. At long last, Eleanor Mortis was born, the heir of the Necromancer.